remember growing up in the 1980s and seeing punk rockers when I would travel to downtown Toronto. I remember seeing these people with dyed spiked hair. They had mohawks, they had piercings, these leather jackets with band names written on the back, and combat boots and Doc Martens. These people look completely post-apocalyptic. And painted on those jackets, they had band names like GBH and The Exploited. So for me, these were names that I associated with punk rock. When I finally heard these bands from the early to mid 1980s, what I heard was some completely abrasive, and again, it's like this apocalyptic heavy tirade against nuclear war and Margaret Thatcher. This stuff was intense, this stuff was heavy, and this stuff did not compromise. So hey, let's investigate British hardcore punk from the 1980s. Thank you again for tuning in to 20th Century Music and Arts. I apologize for not putting out so many videos recently. I've had a very busy schedule. Hopefully I can get more videos out on a more regular basis. Now in this episode, I'm going to look at British hardcore punk albums that were released between the years of 1981 to 1985. I'm really going to look at a lot of the abrasive stuff. It's sometimes called UK82. There's D-beat, even stuff called crust punk. Though there's one album on this list that you could argue is a full-on metal album. There's going to be a lot of styles, and there's lots of bands I left off the list. Anyway, enough of me yakking, let's get started. The first one I'm going to talk about is the one that really set the tone for hardcore punk in the 80s, and of course I'm talking about Punk's Not Dead by The Exploited from 1981. This is Edinburgh, Scotland's finest. In those years after the first wave of punk, you got the rise of post-punk, you got these new wave, and then you can get to these like new romantics and things like that. And there's bands like The Clash and The Damned, they're pursuing kind of different sounds. But The Exploited was a complete reaction to that. They're going to take that aggression of the Sex Pistols and sort of boil it down to its basic alkaloids. It makes the statement that the aggression of three-chord punk is here to stay. And in fact, now it's on steroids. And it completely lives up to the album title. Now, the title track pounds right out of the gate after singer Waddy's dialogue with a chanting crowd, though this is not a live album. The straightforward sound of the album, it really, really pummels the listener. So many great tracks, not just the title track. You got Mucky Pop, you got Army, Life, Sex and Violence, Dole Q, Exploited, Barmy Army, I Believe in Anarchy. This album would be hugely influential, not just on British hardcore, but also on thrash metal and other aspects of the hardcore scene like crust punk, UK82, Oi. This is a great place to start if you want to get to know British hardcore punk of the 1980s. Next on our list we have the debut album of Charged GBH, City Baby Attacked by Rats. This group out of Birmingham, again, it plays driving, unrelenting hardcore. It's the straight power chords chugging and with insane intensity. There's not a lot of variety here, but there are some great choruses one can sing along to, and the production is great. It's got this almost metallic thickness to the sound. Again, so many great tracks besides the title track. You've got Time Bomb, Sick Boy, I Am the Hunted, Heavy Discipline, and the very chaotic Bell End Bop. Great stuff. What's the great thing about these bands is you know they're from the UK because they cannot hide their thick accents when they're singing the choruses. Now, the next band will push the thickness and intensity by bringing in the influence of Motorhead, and they will create the heaviest, again, kind of post-apocalyptic sound that had ever actually been heard to date. From Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire, England, comes Discharge. They put out an album in 1982, Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing. This has got to be the heaviest sounding music in rock history that had ever been put out by that point. There had been nothing heavier before it. The size of the sound is overwhelming, and there are some metal influence lead guitar in here, but this is also fast-paced hardcore punk, and the intensity is in your face and does not let up during the 27 minutes and 27 seconds of the album. The tracks flow from one to another without compromise. The title track, The Nightmare Continues, A Hell on Earth, Free Speech for the Dumb. You really got to listen to the whole thing. It just comes at you like a tidal wave. This album will be a massive influence on Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, Celtic Frost, Sepultura. And there's this whole scene, largely out of Sweden, called D-beat, where bands influenced by this sound, who would take on a name Dis in front of their name, would try to sound like Discharge. And if you just got these 3 albums, you'd have a great sense of British hardcore in the 80s. But you know what? Let's look at some other bands. Next on the list is the album Bloodsuckers by the Varukers, 1983. This band was definitely influenced by all 3 of the previous mentioned bands. And while their hometown is called Leamington Spa, there's nothing relaxing about their music. Again, fast-paced guitar. It's pummeling, shouted vocals and a British accent, real classic UK82 sound. A lot of Discharge influence here as well. A lot of great songs like Nowhere to Go, Don't Conform, Tell Us What We Want to Hear. This is really, really solid stuff. Now, out of Portishead, not the band, but the town, comes the great Chaos UK, and they would release their debut album in 1983. It has, again, a dark, aggressive style that fits in with the rest of the bands on this list. The production's a little rough, but that can kind of add to the charm. Really great stuff like, check out, You'll Never Own Me, Victimized, The Mentally Insane. Yeah, Chaos UK, really, really great, abrasive, heavy stuff. Another band from that Bristol area is Disorder. They've been around since 1980, though they did not release a full-length album until 1984. Though check out their earlier EPs. Under the Scalpel Blade is the debut album. Again, great intensity. It really suffers, though, from primitive production at times. These were people who lived in a big squat, so I don't know if there's a lot of money around for them to record an album, but it's still worth checking out. You got great tracks like Education, Security Guard, and Bent Edge. A really political lyrics and a lot of attitude. Check out Disorder. Also from 1984 is the debut album by Antisect, and it's called In Darkness There Is No Choice. Influenced by both the kind of D-beat of Discharge and the Anarcho-punk of stuff like Crass. This album is fantastic. Again, massively political lyrics and heavy, as intense as hell. It's got a thicker production that gives the album an edge. Check out the tracks They, The Eternal Myth and Paradox, The World's Biggest Runt, Ghost of Mankind, Tortured and Abused. Animal rights and stuff like war are kind of big focal points for Antisect in terms of their lyrics. Now, what if you have one of these bands that decides just to become a heavy metal band? And this is exactly what happened to English Dogs out of Grantham, England. Now, their second album, Forward into Battle. Check out the cover. Released in 1985. This is a full-on metal album, but it's still got this atmosphere and intensity of that apocalyptic British hardcore punk. What's cool here is this is a unique sound that's different from thrash metal or crossover thrash. It's more like the meeting of the new wave of British heavy metal with the kind of roughness of the UK82 sound. You really need to check it out. Maybe it doesn't belong on this list, but hey, it's my list. Anyway, there's so many great songs on this album, like 5 Days to Death, Wall of Steel, and Ordeal by Fire. But remember, you're getting real Iron Maiden, Judas Priest influence here, but it's put through the punk gutter. I absolutely love this sound. Now, another really, really unique variation on British hardcore punk is the album Arise by Amebix, released in 1985. This sound is very, very different. This band fused like the crust punk attitude, but it's with a slower, almost metal sound, but then it's got this weird post-punk experimental element. You can hear the influence of Killing Joke and even Joy Division in there a little bit. Again, what is different here is the tempo has been slowed down, but there's an intensity here. And sometimes the vocals have this almost like Celtic Frost, Venom, first wave of black metal. But then there's this post-punk weirdness and slow, noisy metal riffs. You know, the sound here is absolutely incredible. And, you know, Amebix would not only influence hardcore punk bands, but they were very influential on death and black metal bands as well. The whole album is amazing, but tracks like Axeman, Fear of God, of course the title track, Arise, and The Darkest Hour really stand out. You really got to check these guys out. Now the last of the albums, and this is also from 1985, and is the last one from the list, is Bone Crusher by Broken Bones. They were actually formed by ex-members of Discharge. They create a sound that is, it's almost like an English version of the crossover thrash sound, and definitely being closer to thrash metal than anything the English Dogs were doing. Here though, you have that relentless Discharge sound, but it's got a cleaner production and more guitar leads, but it's really cool stuff. Great tracks like Point of Agony, Treading Underfoot, and Untamed Power. These guys would continue more into a straight-on thrash metal vein, but definitely you want to check this out. Okay, so there was my list of, you know, that apocalyptic British hardcore punk. I know I left out a lot of different genres and bands. Anyway, these sounds were definitely, you know, a counterbalance. They're kind of like the underbelly of society, the sub-zeitgeist to that kind of glamorous sounds of the 80s, especially the British 80s commercial music. But this music, you know, it would be massive inspirational for many musicians, especially those in the numerous subgenres of extreme metal and hardcore punk. You know, do yourself a favor and check out these albums. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and please comment. What do you think about British hardcore punk? Do you have a favorite band? Let me know.